I still remember being brought on my first family holiday to Britain, to London. I'd done a school project on it in Botswana, and I was so excited. I was going to see Big Ben. I was going to see the River Thames. I was going to see everything. I went on the London Underground and I saw a white woman who was begging at the bottom of the stairs. When I tell you I was in a deep state of distress, I stood by her and refused to get on a train. I refused to leave. And my father was like, you know, what is going on? Can we just go? And I was like, but this white person is poor. And I refused to leave until we had given her a £1 coin. And this was like, I could not understand. This was not the Britain I had been taught about.
Now I'm going to lead with a song from Sade. I'm not going to sing it. And it's called Immigrant. And it's the only time I've heard that experience articulated so perfectly. She's talking about her father coming to this land as an immigrant and the struggles that he faced. And there's a few lines in it that sort of go, till they gave him his change and didn't want to touch his hand. Because one of my abiding memories of going into the Asian shops, because most of the corner shops back then were owned by Asian people, is you'd go in there and they would treat you like the shit on the bottom of their shoe.
Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Rigor and flow.
One. Good evening.
Hi. We're back again.
We are back again, and this is Rigor and Flow.
With Aiwan and Tamanda.
Where business meets love.
And culture meets critique.
Okay, what we got today?
First of all, before we get to today, I just want to say I really like your T-shirt. What does it say?
It says more blacks, more dogs, more Irish, and is the response to a UK, in which at one point there were signs in windows that used to say no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. Yeah. And sometimes in the world that we live in today, in 2025, it feels like we're going back to that time where everything is being rolled back. Mm-hmm. The only thing that hasn't changed is the dogs.
But also the blacks and the Irish are still here, as we have always been, and we will continue
It's
to be.
more about whether they're wanted. The dogs
true.
are definitely wanted. Britain's a country obsessed with dogs, so we'll have no problem on that front.
Yeah.
The Irish, I think they're maybe a bit more ahead in acceptance.
I don't know.
You don't think so? Actually,
I'm sure if you asked a few Irish people, they might have a different opinion.
I was going to say, actually, when I think about Kneecap, the Irish band, and the experiences they're having with the British establishment, it would appear that, maybe the Irish and the blacks are still not as wanted as they should be.
Exactly.
We bring so much culture, so much story, energy.
Great music,
great humour.
All the things. I want to start actually a bit left field from that conversation and go to a quote from the incredible author that is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
The goddess.
From your land, one of your people.
Land. Yes.
Who famously said, I wasn't black until I came to America. I became black in America. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not talking about Britain, but let's just substitute America for the West. What do you make of that?
I mean, I've heard it before, you know.
From her, you mean?
Not from her, from other people from the continent who've arrived in the UK as, you know, young adults and older adults. So for me, having been born and raised in the UK, I've always known that I was black.
Yeah.
I've been knowing. So when I think about the smallest aggressions, you know, when I think about going into shops, even shops where I'm a local and I go in there almost every day. And the moment you walk through the door, you see this sort of subtle nod from the shopkeeper or the person on the till to the security guard, which is an indication, follow that one, keep an eye on that one. Even at my big age, got a business, got money, I could pay a lot of those people's wages. And I still get followed around the stores. To the big aggressions that are just outright racism, where, you know, I had an experience just a couple of years ago where I'm walking across the street, minding my business, looking to the left, looking to the right. Another guy's crossing the street, looks across at me. What the fuck are you looking at, you black bitch? Straight.
Where was this?
Unprovoked in Leeds. Unprovoked. And that was the reaction. So for me, this country doesn't let me forget that I'm black.
People are bold.
They're bold. And so I'm under no illusions about that. But obviously, when you were born somewhere else, it's a different story entirely. So my question to you is, you were born in Africa and you came here at a young age. What is your experiences and how do you sort of come to terms with, how do you relate to the Black British identity or term?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the Black British term is a whole thing to get into. I have to say that I did not relate to the term Black British for a very, very long time. In fact, I remember a friend of mine, Dr. Selena Stone, who runs a podcast herself, and it's about faith, spirituality, and Black Christians. And she asked me at one point to come on her show. And when I asked her, who's the audience and who are your guests? And she's like, it's for Black British people. And I was like, that's not me. Even though I know it's me, like intellectually I know it's me, I was just like, I don't even know how to enter that conversation. And
That's
I feel
so
like,
interesting.
yeah.
Because you've been here a while now at this point.
I've been here way longer than I was on the continent at this point. Like I came to the UK in 97. So I've been here for like nearly 30 years at this point, and I still don't see myself as Black British.
And you're still standing.
I'm still standing. But I think part of it is that where I grew up was a Black majority country. And so everyone was Black. And if everyone is Black, being Black is unremarkable. It's normal. So you don't need to identify people by being Black, right? You identify them by the thing that makes them different, which is normally like tribe. We have 12 tribes where I come from in Botswana.
Oh, nice. Like the children of Israel in the Bible.
Oh, is it?
They had 12 tribes and Jesus had 12 disciples.
I hope that's
I always knew
correct.
you lot were special.
Thank you. We are the unknown people of Israel.
Yes. Very unknown.
Yeah, exactly. The people of the Kalahari Israel.
Yes.
Anyway, we had so people by tribal difference, right? Or religious difference, which is something that Chimamanda actually says. She said before she came to America, she was Igbo, she was Catholic, and she was Nigerian, and especially Nigerian when a football match was on,
Yes.
and the Eagles were playing.
The Super Eagles.
So I really relate to that. And I feel like Black Britishness is weird because I didn't become Black until I came to Britain. It was when I went to Belfast and suddenly I was given equalities monitoring forms, which I've never had before. And back then you only had 4 or 5 boxes to choose from. And the box was Black or white or Indian Asian, and then something else. And I was like,
Other.
what? Of some kind of other.
Nebulous other.
Yeah. And I was like, what the hell am I supposed to choose? It literally was Black, white, Asian. And then people would ask me what it was like being the only Black person. And I was like, but in Botswana, I was mixed.
So what about the British part?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because to be honest with you, I never felt more British than I did when I was in Botswana. So as a kid, I was differentiated from some of my other peers by being mixed, right? And although I was born in Botswana, I'd never been to Britain, I inherited my father's nationality, and he's British. And he tried to teach me a lot about British culture. I remember having this Union Jack T-shirt as a toddler. So I'd be like swanning around the Kalahari in this Union Jack T-shirt. And then because I'm actually an 8th Scottish, my father's a 1/4 Scottish, somewhere they got me some tartan kilts, like a red tartan kilt.
So was it in the colours of like the Walker?
Walker,
When
yeah.
we see the shortbread biscuits,
Exactly.
It was that tartan.
Yeah, it was that because we
So
are the
you're part
Walker
of the-
clan.
Oh, you're part of the Walker clan.
Exactly. So
Mad.
I literally had a kilt that colour, and I would
Not
walk around the
sleeping
Kalahari.
with the colonizer.
You have well and truly slept with the colonizer.
Hey, Lord Jesus Christ.
So I was swanning around in that. And to be honest, I was proud of it because I was like, yeah, I'm British, you know, I'm British, mate.
In that accent.
Well, no,
in the Kalahari.
I learned the Cockney accent later. But yeah, I was swanning around. So I felt very British. And then I came to Britain and I was like
disabused of that notion.
I suddenly was like, nah, I'm not British. I do not recognize this place.
So what happened for you to have that realization when you first arrived?
Oh, just everything. You know, the Britain we had been taught about was the Britain where it was Christmas, where it was always snowing. It was a land of plenty. There was a royal family.
You didn't read Dickens then?
We did, well, not till later.
Oh, okay.
After I got here.
Because if you'd have read Dickens, you would know that it's not that.
I hadn't got to Dickens by age 11 when I left. But yeah, I mean, basically it's what you saw in movies and films, and you were shown Big Ben and red telephone boxes and red buses and all these great things and a monarchy and whatever. And then I didn't even get to Ingerland. I went to Belfast, and let me tell you, that was one grey, windy, sideways, rain pouring rock of a place to end up. So I was
sorry
just like,
to the people of Belfast.
Sorry. I was not impressed.
We support the struggle.
Belfast Lives Matter.
Belfast Lives Matter. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say.
Anyway, it was not the Britain I had been told about. And so as a result, and also not one of my peers recognized me as British. Not a single one. All they recognized me as was, oh, look at that wee girl from Africa. You know, so it was just like, oh, so I'm African, not even Botswana. So then I really stepped into, I'm Botswana. So I never became more Botswana than when I left Botswana, and I never became more British than when I was not in Britain.
You know what's so interesting? I hear that a lot from, particularly like my mum's generation. They had received the PR campaign, the British PR campaign, you know, of, you know, poshness, plenty, a land of plenty, highly educated, extremely civilized. In fact, they're the ones who brought us civilization.
Yeah, and that high English they speak.
The high English and the cups of tea and all of that. Only to arrive here in the hood and discover that, in their words, it was the first time that they were seeing white people who were poor.
Yeah.
White people who had behaviors and habits that weren't becoming.
They were savage like they had told us we were, right?
Yeah, that sort of thing. You know, like I remember my mum talking about things like, you know, walking along the streets and seeing like dog shit on the streets, seeing people spitting on the streets, seeing homeless white people, swearing, rough behavior, as she would put it. And it was really a shock to the system.
It was truly a shock. I still remember being brought on my first family holiday to Britain, to London. I'd done a school project on it in Botswana, and I was so excited. I was going to see Big Ben. I was going to see the River Thames. I was going to see everything. I went on the London Underground, and I saw a white woman who was begging at the bottom of the stairs. And when I tell you I was in a deep state of distress, I stood by her and refused to get on a train. I refused to leave. And my father was like, you know, what is going on? Can we just go? And I was like, but this white person is poor. And I refused to leave until we had given her a £1 coin. And this was like, I could not understand. This was not the Britain I had been taught about.
It doesn't fit the PR campaign.
It didn't fit the PR campaign. So that was a shock to my system too. I really feel your mum. It's like a most brutal awakening.
It really is. And then to have that same system then literally shit on you from a great height with all the qualifications. Because very often the education they got in Africa was actually superior to the one that was here. So they're now confronted by, you know, white English people who are nowhere near as educated as they were. And then you're having to be subservient to them. And then they're talking down to you and abusing you and treating you like you are a savage from the jungle.
Yeah, that was exactly.
But you've got a PhD, because a lot of these, our aunties and uncles, they had PhDs, masters, highly qualified people.
Highly. And very well read, very well spoken.
Yes.
That was the biggest shock for me, even as a kid, going to Northern Ireland. They expected I would come with years behind the education system. And my first thing was, you guys don't even speak English properly. That's bad to say, but
no,
that is what I was
you know
thinking.
what? It's so funny because one of the things that people often laugh about with Nigerians is that we know the big words. You know,
you guys know archaic language.
We know archaic language because we've been reading the King James version of the Bible from birth.
Yeah.
And that book is full of the most archaic language you can imagine.
Give me your best words and phrases, because you've come out with some serious phrases in our time together.
That's a good one. And I'm now on the spot and I'm going to think very carefully. But I remember one uncle saying, remove that thing with immediate alacrity. And I was like, alacrity?
Not alacrity.
I was like, I still am not quite sure what alacrity means. I'm probably going to have to look it up. You know what I mean?
Can we look it up now?
Oh, absolutely.
I need to know.
Alacrity.
I need to know what alacrity means, because I've heard the word, but I do not know.
Immediate, brisk and cheerful readiness.
Uncle said with brisk and what?
And brisk and cheerful readiness.
Oh no. Okay, with alacrity.
In other words, do what I'm telling you and do it with a smile. So, you know, it's that kind of education, right, that they had. They really understood the English language and they took it as a matter of seriousness to be able to speak the language that these colonizers brought to their land.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's so interesting that, thinking about your experience and the experiences of some of my elders, that the further you are from home, the more aware you are of that absence. And so the more that you cling to any aspects of that home that you can, I guess, in order to bolster your identity in a world that refuses to see you as part of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more than to bolster your sense of identity. It's to retain some sense of connection to people and to land and to something that you can't feel. So has to exist only in your mind and in your spirit, you know, because you can't touch it, the soil. You can't touch your loved ones. So, yeah, I think it is interesting, although that doesn't really make sense for my British experience, I have to say.
Well, I wanted to ask you, so obviously those were your early years when you're talking about Belfast. As you got a bit older and you'd spent more time in the country, how did it evolve? How did things change?
I would say things evolved quite a lot. When I left Belfast, I went to a very posh private school in the Midlands in England. And I think England had a totally different race politics because there had been more black and brown people essentially in the country. And what was interesting about that school was I had been entirely surrounded by white people in Northern Ireland. Suddenly I had quite a lot of Chinese students around me and quite a few African students around me, but they were almost all Nigerian.
Okay.
So I had the only other African girls I could find who I spent a lot of time with were West African. And again, I became even more Botswana because it was very obvious to me meeting those girls that we came from like very different cultures.
All right, tell me some of the differences that you observed.
I have to say that your people are generally much more, I mean, there were a lot of Yoruba girls in that group and generally much louder, much more gregarious than Botswana. But we're like horizontal. I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah, you guys are chill.
We're very chill by comparison. So, but I really enjoyed it. I loved having other African students.
Yeah, because it would have made a big difference to where you were before. It's like, at least you can see people that roughly are similar to what you grew up with.
Yeah, and can acknowledge you and see you as African. And that African doesn't have to come with this stereotype of, you know, your family live in a tree house, you have lions in your background. That was the kind of thing I heard from my peers in my previous school in an all-white environment.
Yeah, although Botswana, you probably did have lions in your
we didn't.
in your backyard.
We didn't.
Where are the lions? Oh, so the lion. Where are the lions for you guys?
In the north of the country, in the Okavanga Delta, or in a game reserve down south.
Certainly more lions than we had in Nigeria. At least
You
apart.
guys don't have them.
I don't think we have lions. I know where I come from in Edo State, we don't have lions.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even know if we have them in a zoo. Maybe there's one or two, I don't know. And if they are, I feel sorry for them because I know they're probably not
They
being
don't have
well.
siblings.
No. Just one gaunt lion somewhere.
Oh, dear.
Oh, God.
So, yeah, I guess anyway.
So private school. And also I imagine with it being a private school, the kind of Africans would have been, I think, quite wealthy. I'm thinking oil money.
Listen, they were some wealthy, wealthy girls.
Yeah.
Oil money, God knows what money. I remember a friend of mine's father going underground on the run because people were after him because he had done some corruption after we left school.
Was he Nigerian?
Yes, and a very well-known person. I'm not saying any names, but
no names.
known in the public consciousness. So all I'm saying is it was a different kind of African to any African I had come across because we have a different way.
Well, you know, Africa is a continent.
It is.
And there's a great variety and diversity.
I was quite well travelled within Africa before meeting Nigerian people. So I had some sense of that, you know. Anyway, so there was that. And then I have to say, talking of Black Britishness, the first time I feel like I really understood that term was when I left school, moved to London to do music, and suddenly I was meeting for the first time ever people who were born in Britain and were Black and spending time with them.
Oh, wow, that was your first time.
First time. So from
That's interesting.
18, 19 plus. And it was generally other musicians I collaborated with as an artist, wrote with, or who, like, we played music together. Or I'd say my big schooling was I took an internship at a Black publishing company called Westbury Music in Brixton. And they had the music catalogues for like all of the best Black British acts and music from the Caribbean that was really popular here. Mm-hmm. So they had like reggae catalogues, but then they also had like Janet Kay. They had like just silly gay. Yeah, exactly. It was just all the best in Black British music. And it was Black Caribbean people at the forefront. And then I was like, oh, this is Black Britishness in the way that people talk about it. Mm-hmm. And again, it's a culture that's very far from the way I grew up in Blackness.
That is super interesting, that it took that long for you to actually encounter Black Britishness. So it wasn't just by stepping onto the shores that you encountered it. It actually took a certain immersion in the world of work. When you encountered that Black British culture, how did things change for you internally? Did anything switch when you encountered it and realized, okay, this is a group of people that have a very specific identity?
I think it took a really long time for it to change for me. It didn't immediately change because what I understood was that this was a way of understanding Blackness and Britishness that was entirely different from anything I had ever had. These were people who understood themselves as being from Britain, and I've never understood myself that way. What it did do was make me understand, oh, I get read entirely different by this group of people.
Oh, okay.
So that group of people, remember, I've come out of a posh school and I'm mixed race. So what I tended to find was people would look at me and be like, she's stush. She thinks too much of herself. And they wouldn't always say it, but I could feel that energy. In the years since, I've understood what was really going on in that dynamic. It was about colorism. It was about class. It was about all sorts of things. At the time, I just couldn't understand why I couldn't connect and why I felt so rejected.
Have you since been able to connect?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I understand it now in a different way, but that took some time.
Was it something you had to change, or was it just meeting the right kinds of Black British people?
I had to do some work and I had to change.
Okay. Tell me.
But before we get into that, I want to hear about your story because it comes much later and it's more of an adult me.
Okay.
I would say.
Okay, that makes sense.
But yeah, so tell me about you because you obviously have a very different experience. Black Britishness is something I guess you've always understood or related to?
Yes, as in I definitely have understood it. Relating to it, I would say I've always had a little bit of a uncomfortable relationship with the term Black British.
Okay, how so?
I feel like it's tricky because my mum came here and gave birth to me as an immigrant. And for her, it was really just a case of almost being repotted. Like when you repot a plant, it's already established, right? It's already got the roots. It just needs to be in a bigger plant pot, right? And you take it out, you kind of shake down the roots a little bit, wash it out a bit, and then you put it in the bigger pot. But because it's already got the roots, it can easily sort of find itself because it's rooted. It had roots from somewhere.
Strong, deep
roots. Yeah. And that helps it to be grounded. And, my mum was very, very grounded in her Nigerianness. It was just like, I'm Nigerian. All these white people, whatever they're doing here, this nonsense, it doesn't concern me. I'm Nigerian and I'm Nigerian. If you want to call me black bitch, you want to call me, it doesn't matter, So, whereas for me, I didn't have those roots.
Yeah.
It's almost like I'm trying to put down roots, but I'm trying to put down roots in thorny, rocky soil.
Oof.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's difficult. And so you kind of see your mum and she's got her roots and she's strong and she's confident. She doesn't really care. So you're trying to maybe graft to her a little bit and really hold on to that Nigerian identity because you see strength in that. You see a confidence. You see like a resistance against this system that's around you, right? And so then what happens there is that, yes, you are British, but you're also Nigerian. Yeah. And actually it's your Nigerianness that gives you strength and it gives you confidence. When you go to that church and you're surrounded by your Nigerian community, when your mum makes it clear that when you cross the threshold into this house, this is Nigeria.
Yeah.
And when you cross it the other way, that's Britain.
Yeah.
What happens out there, I don't know. But here, this is how it works. It gives you a sense of confidence.
Yeah.
So the thing is, when I think of myself, it's like, I feel I'm Nigerian, British.
Okay, British Nigerian? Do you use that term?
Nigerian British.
Okay.
I always put the Nigerian first. If you look on my bios, it's always Nigerian British.
Okay, why? Because
of the way I was raised and because, I don't know, back then, right, in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't cool to be African. It was terrible. You got bullied.
Yeah.
But the people you got bullied by in school were Caribbean kids, specifically Jamaican kids.
Yeah.
They were the people that bullied me for being African. Now it's cool to be African, especially Nigerian, because of Afrobeats music, because of the Super Eagles and the football kit, because of so much. Like we've brought so much to the world.
Afrobeat for sure, I think, has been a
huge
game changer. I mean,
Absolutely.
Nollywood was being exported before then, but often like it
was
felt
still
like
a niche
Nigerians
thing.
in the diaspora or
Yeah.
But Afrobeat
Afrobeats.
guys changed the game.
That's what I'm saying. The dancing, the slang, and I will be forever grateful and so proud of all the young Afrobeat stars who really changed the name Nigeria in the eyes of people around the world. But back then it wasn't that way. You were looked down upon, you were ridiculed, you were mocked. Horrible things happened to me at the hands of Jamaican children, right?
Such as?
Oh, everything from having my property destroyed, being hit. I almost had my fingers dislocated at one point. Just hounded, called names.
Because of being African specifically.
Specifically.
Yeah.
And the issue was that some of their parents had told them that Africans were dirty people, they're just less than.
Yeah, because they internalized that from this system, like the white peers.
Absolutely. And then the other thing was that they felt like Africans had sold their ancestors into slavery.
Yeah.
And that made us treacherous,
not
traitorous
to be trusted
people, not to be trusted people.
Yeah.
So suddenly you're around black people, but you're not accepted by black people.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, Black British, are we all just, I mean, back then it was Afro-Caribbean. I was like, well, I'm not Afro. What does Afro mean? Afro, I mean, there's Afro hair, but I'm not just Afro. You can't just call me Afro. The fuck is that shit? Do you know what I mean? And then you lot get Caribbean.
They like to call me Afro in Belfast. Or just Macy Gray.
Oh God, not Macy Gray.
Or Scary Spice, actually, before Macy Gray.
Oh no,
anyway,
all
sorry.
the stereotypes. But yeah, so I had a problem on that front. And so I was just like, I was at odds with the term because I was like, I'm not Afro-Caribbean. Don't understand the Black British thing because you've lumped me into this monolith and there's a whole chunk of this monolith that doesn't accept me.
Yeah.
So really, I'm going to stay grafted to the Nigerianness.
Yeah.
I am Nigerian and I am British.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So the dominant group at that time was the Caribbeans, specifically Jamaicans. And it was, you know, dancehall music was a massive thing. Reggae music was a massive thing. Ska music, you know.
All of which you love.
I adore that music.
Yeah.
I adore Caribbean culture. I adore Jamaican culture. I really do. You know, the fashion was very Jamaican. The biggest black stars on the pop scene and the urban music scene were Jamaican. You had Carnival, of course, every year. Mm-hmm. It was the dominant black culture. Obviously, that's changed over the last few years, but that was the culture into which I was born.
Yeah.
You know?
So how do you relate to that Caribbean culture then? Because I know it's not yours, but you have this complete love of it in a way that really surprised me. Like, I remember you going to Jamaica for this Audible Hidden Histories project with Nova Reid that you recorded last year. And I've never seen you so excited. You were like, this is a dream of mine. And I'm like, how did you get there? Because you also had these really quite difficult peer group experiences with Jamaican kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been wanting to go to Jamaica since I was 13.
Yeah.
And to finally get a chance to go to this land that I'd heard so much about, I've consumed so much of the culture that it was a dream come true.
Yeah.
To get there, it really took a lot of me choosing to try and learn, to understand this group of people that had both contributed so much beauty and positivity and strength.
Yeah.
But had also been the cause of so much hurt and so much pain.
In your life.
In my life.
Yeah.
And I wanted to try and understand that. So for me, it was reading books. You know, I remember I read a book called Journey to an Illusion. Brilliant book. I'll have to put a link to it in the description or the show notes. But that shed so much light on the Caribbean experience in terms of how they had arrived into this country on boats, an example of which is the Windrush. Yeah. The experiences that they'd had when they arrived here. And suddenly I was like, your experience is actually very similar to my mum's experience. And actually we are going through the same things.
Yeah.
But we've been divided through the messaging that we've received from the white people who went out to go and be taking slaves and doing nonsense there and then colonizing over here where I'm from.
So it's basically divide and conquer so many generations later still playing out.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. And so I remember joining the African Caribbean Society in every uni that I attended.
Really?
Absolutely. As you get older, you make better friends who aren't going to bully you and mash you up because you're African. So I had a lot of Caribbean friends from like St. Kitts, Jamaica, Barbados. I still do, and immersed myself in that sort of Caribbean world. And like I say, it was good in my later years to be able to reconcile that this beautiful culture that gave me all of these wonderful things could also give me beautiful friends who would teach me more about the Black experience beyond Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting because it's so relatable to me. When you asked me earlier, how did I make sense of and understand Black British people, i.e. Caribbean people, my journey was a little bit similar to you. And I think I first really started to understand that through becoming more politically conscious. And I've always been interested in Black history from as long as I can remember. I was reading books about colonialism and Africa and trying to understand my own heritage, but it almost always focused on the African continent and very rarely the Caribbean, for example. But when I was about 28, I started a master's course, which was in sociology. And I did evening study at Birkbeck College alongside my full-time job. And my first module, or one of my early modules, was race, racism, and post-coloniality. And that's when I started to understand histories of migration to this country, the experiences of Caribbean people, settlement in Britain, and this whole thing about people struggling to be represented in this political system, struggling for an identity, Black Britishness, that would mean they got listened to by politicians or could even become politicians themselves. So yeah, it was reading books from people like Paul Gilroy, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, that I came to understand why this term was so important for us, for Black Caribbeans, but for all of us who end up here and are seen as Black British and have much in common, even though we're also very, very different. And I think that's when I started to respect the term, understand why we need it, understand why it's been so important.
I think that's powerful, because the thing that I think is important about the term Black British identity is that it does give us a collective umbrella from which to tackle the system head on.
Yeah.
If we're doing it Nigerian over here, Ghanaian over there, it's difficult. Whereas as Black British, we come together as a force, 3% of the population or whatever we are, and we say we want our rights. We want laws that prevent and stop or punish at least discrimination wherever it's found.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And this is where I'm going to be a bit of a geek and an academic as a race scholar.
Go ahead.
But one of the main distinctions people make when they're talking about race and ethnicity is that with ethnicity, there's an element of choice. You can, it's not just, blackness as a racial category, your skin color, your phenotype, i.e. how wide your nose is, your lips or whatever. Those things are not chosen, and they're ways you are made other, right?
Yeah.
But your ethnicity, you can choose it. You could choose to be Black and British. There's some element of choice involved.
Okay, interesting.
So there's different ethnic identities within Black Britishness as well, right?
Yeah, and because you've got Nigerian.
Yeah, you've got Nigerian, you've got Caribbean, you've got Southern African or whatever. But there's an element of we are defining this identity ourselves in order to make a case to the state for what we want. To be recognised in our desire to be not criminalised, to be educated fairly, to have access to equal healthcare, for example.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that differentiating between,
Yeah.
Go on.
I was going to say I wrote a whole chapter on it in my thesis.
I love that. Tell us what the title of the thesis is.
Oh, God. I can't remember. Race, Religion and Worldviews, and autoethnographic, basically autobiographical account. Whatever. It's academic. It was too long. I studied race, religion in organisations as an EDI diversity practitioner.
You're lucky that you did it when you did it, because if it was now, Trump would have wiped you out.
I did it knowing the Trumps were coming. May it be seen and documented here as I see it. I know you said that reading books was, or one book in particular, was really important to you in terms of understanding Black Britishness. Was there quite a long political journey for you? Was there any kind of political consciousness for you similar to what I went through?
Yeah, no, for sure. I dived into the American civil rights and all of the icons from America.
From what sort of age?
I would say around 14.
Oh, okay. So roughly when I was reading all about African colonialism, then the same sort of time.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I think diving into that side of the Black experience in this world helped me to do was almost transcend the Nigerian versus Jamaican thing that was going on in my world that was really quite fraught with a lot of tension and a lot of pain. There I could just immerse myself in the Black struggle for liberation with these heroes who actually embraced Africa. So what I found with people like, Malcolm X and, Muhammad Ali and people like that is that they embraced Africa. So you would see pictures of them in Africa with African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and so on and so forth. You'd see like Nina Simone out there in those I guess those meetings that they would have out there, you know, where they'd be talking about the Black struggle and the importance of Pan-Africanism.
Didn't she go and relocate to Africa for a
She
period?
did, Liberia.
Yeah, Liberia. Yeah, that's what I thought.
And so suddenly you're seeing Africa in a more positive light, and you're seeing people that you revere talking about Africa in a positive light. They're not just talking about Africa, they're visiting Africa. They are wearing clothes synonymous with Africa, like the dashiki, you know?
Yeah.
And they've got their fists in the air, and it's a powerful symbol, right?
Yeah.
But then within their message is this message of Pan-Africanism, which is that all African descended people have to unite against the white supremacist system. And that's all of us. So Caribbeans, Africans in the diaspora, African Americans in America, we all have to unite if we're going to be able to push back against the system and get our rights and be treated as equals in this society. And so what I started to do was I started to find Caribbean people who were more aligned with that worldview.
Yeah.
So, you know, as I got a bit older, I became part of like African Caribbean societies at university. Suddenly you're meeting Caribbean people who they're all about the struggle.
Yeah.
They're all about Black empowerment.
Yeah.
They're all about Pan-Africanism and unity. They have a great desire to retrace their roots back to Africa.
Yeah.
They're, again, wearing dashikis and things like that.
Yeah.
And around them, I'm not seen as a dirty, poor, traitorous African.
Yeah.
I'm seen as, oh, you're from the continent.
Yeah.
You're seen as someone that, you know, maybe could help them understand certain aspects, or that they could just connect with through that shared love of Africa.
Yeah. And a shared identity. It's you're not only for or from the continent, you're for the people, Black people wherever they are.
Yes.
And African people wherever they are.
Exactly.
Yeah. I definitely had that experience too. And, you know, today I work with many, many people from the continent and many, many Caribbean people who share that vision, value, politics. And we're all working for that same sense of justice and understanding of who we are and how we've got to this point.
100%. And I think in that learning phase, one of the things that I discovered that I had never appreciated, because nobody had ever taught me, is that the education that Caribbeans were getting in their homeland was that England was the motherland.
Yeah. Yep.
We never got taught that England was the motherland. England was a place that you come to top up your education, make money, and take the money back to Nigeria to build your houses and do your thing. That's it. It was not seen as a motherland, because our motherland is Nigeria or whichever country you came from in Africa, right? This is just a stopping point. It's a transition point. It's not the end point.
Yeah.
And so I feel like as I started to learn a bit more about the Caribbean experience in the UK, I started to really feel a strong sense of empathy.
Yeah.
That you have come from your homeland to the place that was supposed to be the motherland and treat you like a mother should, with nurturing, care and compassion. And instead what you got was vitriol and brutality. Contempt, you know, ejected from your homes, not able to even buy homes, and having to come up with your own systems
while
to buy
building the
homes.
whole national health system.
Not even just the national health, everything.
Yeah.
Because after World War II, Britain was a mess.
Needed to be rebuilt.
It needed to be rebuilt. Hence the call to the Commonwealth to come and help rebuild the nation.
Yeah. And I think that's where your story is interesting, because actually what you're saying is Chimamanda also talks about this in her work on Blackness. She says that because she was Nigerian, everything was Nigeria. Nigeria was never a settler colony.
No.
And she says her identity and her sense of Blackness and her response to racism and being made Black with all these negative stereotypes would have been totally different if she, in her words, came from Southern Africa, where I came from, or places that had been settler colonies. Because
just define a settler colony.
So a settler colony is, during the colonial era, there were territories that the British, you know, I suppose annexed and decided were theirs, and they mostly kept out of those places on a day-to-day level. They co-opted leaders, African leaders in a place like Nigeria through it, but they never actually built homes and settled and came en masse to those lands. So the British went to Kenya en masse, to South Africa en masse, and they settled there. Okay. And so they're...
Which is why, till today, you know, there are parts of Kenya. I remember going to Kenya for the first time for my film, Kenyan Christian Queer, and seeing whole areas that were just white, like just white people. And I know for a fact you will never find that in Nigeria.
Yeah, exactly. And so therefore they those strong
practically
roots
own those areas. And they're looking at you like, what the fuck are you doing here? Yeah. And obviously the Nigerian in me is like, who the fuck are you to tell me?
Precisely. So this goes back to what you were saying about your mum. Those strong roots in a Nigerian context are even stronger, I think, than other parts of the continent, because Nigerians were with only other black people.
Yeah.
Building their own identity without interference from people who thought they were superior.
That part.
So there's definitely one more thing I want to get to with this Black Britishness thing, because I don't think this discussion is complete without it. Mm-hmm. So in this country, while when we say Black and British today, many people will hear people of African descent or African people, there was a very long period from about the 80s, early 80s through to the 90s, of what was called political blackness. Mm-hmm. Okay. And political blackness, Black Britishness, was everyone who was not white, essentially. Black and brown people were called Black British. In other words, if we use that term, there are definitely people in this country who are Asian, of Indian descent, maybe Pakistani descent, maybe more Pakistani descent than Indian, to be honest, who consider themselves Black and British. And I know this has become like seriously unfashionable, especially since Black Lives Matter. But I am curious how you relate to that. When you heard the term Black British, did you know that people of Asian descent also consider themselves Black and British?
Later on.
Yeah.
And I struggled with it. Because of my experiences with the Asian community growing up. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to lead with a song from Sade. I'm not going to sing it.
Why? You have such a beautiful voice.
No. That's not going to happen. No. But it's on her Lovers Rock album.
Okay.
And it's called Immigrant. And it's the only time I've heard that experience articulated so perfectly. Because in it, she says... She's talking about her father coming to this land as an immigrant and the struggles that he faced. And there's a few lines in it that sort of go, he'd go to the shop and this is the line, he didn't know what it was to be black till they gave him his change and didn't want to touch his hand. Because one of my abiding memories of going into the Asian shops, because most of the corner shops back then were owned by Asian people, is you'd go in there and they would treat you like the shit on the bottom of their shoe. And you would go to the till and you'd pay your money. And when they gave you the change, they were so anti you that they didn't even want to touch you, that they would throw the change into your hand. So as not to touch your hand. And the change would sometimes fall on the counter. Sometimes it will fall on the floor and you'd be scrabbling around to pick up your change. The attitude they had towards us in their shops was really, really bad. I won't go into all the details, but it wasn't a great experience when it came to the Asian community for us growing up. Mm-hmm. Now, I remember when I moved to Leeds and I got on a bus for the first time, first and foremost, the buses in Leeds only have one door. So you go on and off the same door. That always used to throw me. And I'd get on the bus, white working class bus driver. I gave him the money for the fare and he'd give me his change, and he has this little hole obviously that he puts his hand through to drop the change onto the little tray, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But he wouldn't do that. He's waiting for you to put your hand there and then he'd put the change into your hand as opposed to onto the tray that's there for the change, and he would touch your hand. And I was like, I remember going, this is a white man intentionally touching my hand. Bus 1, it happened. Bus 2, it happened. Bus 3, this is a common thing. Yeah. And I was like, that is crazy that a white guy is happy to touch my hand. But for most of my life, these Asian people in these shops didn't want to touch our hand. And so I don't feel like Asians, particularly back then, accepted us as part of them. But I think when it came to getting their rights, we all realized we need to be together to get them. And then what happened is when we got our rights, they got them more than we did. It was often trickle down economics and it trickled down in degrees of lightness. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so you feel like colorism was a feature of that.
It was a feature of it, you know? And I don't know how to say this, and it's probably controversial and probably people are going to come for me in the comments, but that is my experience. That was my experience of growing up with Asian people back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I heard versions of that kind of a story a lot researching race in my PhD. Mm-hmm. And I ended up writing about this very specific tension in my PhD. And I remember it being one of the bits I was so scared to name, because what you don't want to do is undermine solidarity between people. No. But the bottom line is anti-Black racism plays out within our communities and caste differences. And so,
I would say that it hasn't, I think that things are better between younger Asians and Black people, but I think still inherent, there is still some anti-Blackness between Asians and Black people, even still today, if we're being very, very honest.
I've definitely experienced it firsthand. So I think I have plenty of Asian friends who share a politics with us and would absolutely acknowledge that exists, and in fact in their own families, because anti-Blackness and colorism plays out there,
and that's where it plays out most strictly, you know.
Yeah, but also
strongly.
I mean, I think there were loads of people who were both for the project of political blackness and loads of people who were against it, including Asians themselves, because they were like, even as Asians, we're not a monolith. We've come from contexts in Asia where we have never understood ourselves as the same people, because we also have these ethnic, religious differences,
Hindus,
right?
Hindus,
Muslims, all of these kinds of things. So there were many people, and also not wanting to be, Black is never how I've been identified. White's a bit like me coming, now you're Black.
You've got to tick that box.
But you've never known yourself as that, you know? So it was like this project, this thing that's meant to help us to get representation as a group of people, it eventually like fragmented.
Yes.
And so you've had, many scholars have written about this, from Kahinde Andrews to Claire Alexander, who has, I think she wrote about Breaking Black. It was part of our getting solid ground in this country, I think, has been to go, hey, we're not a monolith.
Yeah. But I also appreciate that you need numbers, because the percentages in this country are so small that unless we are united, it's hard to break ground. But again, I'm not going to do that at the sacrifice of my own, dignity and stuff like that. You're not going to look down on me and then try and link arms with me, because that doesn't even make any sense.
None whatsoever.
To me,
Yeah.
So
where do you think this leaves us overall? Like, how, it's very complicated, isn't it? So how do you relate to the idea of Black Britishness today, would you say?
I understand the importance of Black Britishness. I understand it as something that unites us in a struggle for equality, communal wealth building. I think it's really important. I still see myself as Nigerian.
Yeah.
I'm Nigerian British, but I'm also Black British. And it's okay to have both, Yeah,
I agree. And we do all have multiple identities we cling to in a way.
We do.
For different reasons at different times we call upon them.
Absolutely. What about you? How do you relate to the term Black British?
I think similarly to you, I have certain discomforts with it. Mm-hmm. And I recognize its limitations as an idea. But I also understand exactly why it's needed. And I think it's a very powerful term. And it shapes almost everything I do in my work today. I feel I wouldn't be able to do the work I do today if it weren't for Black Britishness as a term, and if it weren't for the many people who struggled for us to get recognition. And I guess I'm interested that we both are saying we have some relationship to it, but we've also had these like very different journeys.
Yeah.
To this country in some way and to that identity. I don't really know what to make of that.
Well, obviously we're in a relationship.
Yeah.
For you, would you call us a Black British couple?
That's a very good question. I think other people would be more likely to call us a Black British
Yeah,
couple
absolutely.
than I would myself. I would not call us that. But I think if there was an American person listening,
They would
or
call
a
us
person
that.
on the continent, that's what they would say.
Yes.
What do we make of that? I don't know. I think for me, there's so much sameness in our sense of blackness. Like, we happen to be two African descended people who have roots to the continent, but there's so much difference that's not captured under that term Black Britishness. Where would you say there's sameness and difference in our Black British identity as a couple?
Well, the sameness, and it's one of the things I appreciate, is that we're both African, both raised by African mums. And then the difference is obviously you were actually born and raised in Africa, and I was born and raised in the UK. So there's a bit more of I feel like there's more of a groundedness in my Black Britishness, maybe, than yourself.
Yeah.
And I think another difference is actually maybe slightly separate from the Black part,
Yeah.
and focusing more on the British part, is class.
Definitely, yeah.
Because obviously you're raised more middle class, went to private school, very firmly working class, raised on sink estates and went to the roughest schools, most of which have been closed down because they were that bad. And then I think as well, again, thinking more about that British side of things and also the variety that is within that term Black, is that colorism, the differences, that there's no colorism in our relationship, of course. But what I'm saying is, you think there is?
No, I think we can say there's no colorism, but we live in a world that responds to those things regardless. So it depends what you mean.
Okay. Let me. So what I mean is that in a world that sees shades of color, then obviously me being a darker skinned person and you being a lighter skinned person, there's something about your proximity to whiteness that is also a factor in how the Black British thing plays out with us, but also as we step out into the world and the world exerts its influence on us,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I'd say that those are some of the similarities and the differences.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess I'd be fine with being called a Black British couple because on one level it's true, but I would be worried that people wouldn't recognize those differences in a way that's unhelpful. Right. I think it is important in a relationship that we're able to talk about, okay, but you're Black mixed race and you're Black. And
there has to be nuance.
Yeah, there has to be nuance, and there have to be a way for us to talk about those things and how they show up in a relationship. And yeah, the things that bind us and the things that can present challenges out there and in here.
Fully. So I spoke earlier about the impact of people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And one of the quotes that I love from him, which kind of made me a lot more open-minded about a lot of things actually, beyond just being a Black person, was he said, and I'm going to read it from my screen here, but he said, "Ignorance of each other is what has made unity impossible in the past. Therefore, we need enlightenment. We need more light about each other. Light creates understanding. Understanding creates love. Love creates patience, and patience creates unity. Once we have more knowledge about each other, we will stop condemning each other and a united front will be brought about." And I feel like in this age where there's so much division and there's so many bad actors on the political stage doing all kinds of madness, I think the more we unite together, particularly along class lines, the better things will be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be about race. It really shouldn't. And so, yeah, Malcolm X said it all.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good quote. I fear, although it shouldn't be about race, it has been, and will probably continue to be. And so therefore the light becomes more important. And I guess to finish, I would be curious to know from people listening, like, how do you relate to Black Britishness, whoever you are? What does the term mean to you?
And as always, you can reach out to us at rigorandflow@gmail.com. That's rigor, RIGOURANDFLOW@gmail.com with your questions, your thoughts, your feedback. We will answer any questions in a subsequent episode. And you can get all the information about people we've spoken about and organizations we've spoken about in the show notes and the show description. And we will see you on the next episode.
See you next time.